you just described Labour doing a deal that it says it doesn't want to do as a prospect made in hell. That we're going up from chaos and ruin. How far are we going to get on the fearometer?
Well, I think it is very, very worrying, because we haven't had in our recent history an example of a nationalist party from one part of the United Kingdom playing a part in the government of the whole of the United Kingdom, saying very frankly, I'll make Ed Miliband Prime Minister, I'll write the first budget, you can't have Trident submarines unless we're going to cut all these other aspects of defence, HS2 won't be built in the way that all the parties in the United Kingdom up to now have agreed. That's only in 24 hours, those three examples I've just given you. Now, I think calling that a chilling prospect or a frightening prospect, I think that is not an understatement. Not an overstatement, I'm afraid.
But the Labour won't sign up to any of those policy positions.
Well, they won't sign up to a coalition, but Labour have been asked, dozens of times, do you rule out having any form of arrangement with the SNP? And they won't answer the question. In the last 24 hours, Andy Burnham, Shadow Health Secretary, Angela Eagle, Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, saying, well, let's wait and see, and I'm sure we'll talk to everybody, and perhaps there are things we can do together. I think genuinely this is a very frightening prospect. The SNP, look, Nicola Sturgeon is a deeply plausible politician and speaks very clearly and all the rest of it, but she's only got one major aim in life, and that is to break up the United Kingdom. These separatists, they're not interested in making the Westminster Parliament stronger. I mean, ask yourself this question. Does Nicola Sturgeon at the end of 5 years want people to look back and go, oh, well, that was a good government in Westminster, the Westminster Parliament's working well for me? No, of course not. She wants to break up the Westminster Parliament and break up our country.
But that's just minority governments. Labour have said nothing other than if the parliamentary arithmetic falls like that, they'd have to consider the views of all the minority parties. That's just how it would work.
They should do what I'm doing, which is to rule out any form of arrangement with the SNP.
You physically stop SNP MPs going through the division.
You can't physically stop them voting, but you can stop any form of conversation or agreement or understanding with them, because there is no understanding you can reach with a group of people that want to break up your country.
Now, hang on though. When you were Conservative leader in 2007, you must have green-lighted Annabel Goldie supporting the SNP in a minority government in Holyrood.
But there's a world of difference, because of course in the Holyrood Parliament, that is a parliament that the SNP thinks ought to exist.
Did you give permission for that arrangement?
I talked to Annabel Goldie about all those things.
And you said, yes, we will support, as Conservatives, a minority SNP government.
No, there's a huge difference, because the Holyrood Parliament is something the SNP believe in. Right? The Westminster Parliament, they think, should be abolished. They think the United Kingdom shouldn't exist. So this is not a group of friendly people coming down to Westminster with some good ideas for how to run Britain. All they want to do is to create a set of circumstances where the breakup of our country becomes more likely.
You could have pulled the plug on the Alex Salmond government in Scotland back in 08-09 when he was struggling to pass the budget, but you allowed your Scottish leadership to continue.
Yeah, but there's a world of difference.
We wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't even had a referendum.
Well, there's a world of difference between what happens in Holyrood, a parliament that the SNP believe in, and what happens in Westminster, a parliament that the SNP don't believe in.
Can I take you back to September the 19th, to 7 a.m, when you made that speech after the referendum? At 5 a.m, Alistair Darling calls you and says, do not do this. You're letting Alex Salmond back in the front door. Isn't the truth? You're saying that there are threats from Labour and the SNP, but your actions at 7 a.m. let the SNP back in the game when they've been defeated.
I don't accept that for a moment. The SNP, the proposition of separation was defeated, and that remains the case. But as Prime Minister, I think it's right to speak for the whole of the United Kingdom. And I think it's quite right that just as we've delivered on Scottish devolution, we're going to deliver more on Welsh devolution. We've maintained and actually strengthened the institutions in Northern Ireland. So it's time for the English voice to be heard as well. And
so stoking up English nationalism?
No, not at all. I don't think the English are nationalistic at all. But what I think people in England want to know is, just as there is the ability of Scottish MPs now to effectively set their own income tax rates, so English MPs in the Westminster Parliament should be able to do the same thing. It's an unbelievably reasonable proposition. I mean, ask yourself this question: why is it that Ed Miliband is happy to work with me on Scottish devolution, Welsh devolution, Northern Irish devolution, but when it comes to England, he won't even have that conversation? So frightened is he of this issue, which I think is completely wrong.
Your speech today talks about this Carlisle principle. It seems to be in the back of your mind, and if you look at the work the Scottish Conservatives did, that there is a vein of thought that sees Britain becoming a bit more federalised? Could you imagine the United Kingdom after 5 years?
I don't think a full sort of federal state works, because when you look at the United Kingdom, England is so much bigger than the other parts that I think it'd be a very unbalanced federal system. So I think what we have to do is to make devolution work better in the nations of our United Kingdom. So Scottish and Welsh parliaments, in my view, that should have these tax-raising powers. So they're not just organisations for spending money, they've got responsibility for raising it. And then in England, I think what we need is the ability for English MPs to have the decisive say over those matters that affect England. Then I think the issue could settle down. We haven't reached a resting place on this issue, and that's what I badly want us to reach.
So you were talking the good life at the Manifesto launch last week, and now we have images of hell from an SNP supported Labour.
Well, I don't know whether you were at the rally I was just speaking at, the first half of which was very clear about the positive message, about a plan that's working, 2 million more people in work, 750,000 more businesses, a strongly growing economy. I mean, there's an incredibly positive message and positive offer from the Conservative Party, but I don't hide from people the fact that there is a choice. All of this is put at risk by Ed Miliband and the SNP. Out of our own, I mean, Nicola Sturgeon's key ask in her manifesto today is an additional £148 billion of borrowing. Now, don't tell me that's not important. That is a massive statement of intent by a party that thinks it could hold, Ed Miliband's feet to the fire in government.
To be clear, though, you're saying that this is relevant because Labour can't win a majority, but you don't know that. So,
Well,
we've looked at the poll.
The figures.
Have you become a psephologist, Prime Minister?
Well, I haven't, but all the psephologists I know, and indeed every other thing, points out that it's almost impossible for Ed Miliband now to win an overall majority. Now, given that,
same goes for the Conservatives.
No, that's not the case. We are 23 seats short of a majority. So if we hold the seats we have and win 23 more seats, perfectly possible in our system, then we'd have a majority.
Respectfully, you haven't had a poll showing a 7% lead since the spending review of 2010.
We had a poll with a 6% lead last week, for instance. So anyway, the only poll that counts is on polling day. But look, the maths of the election is quite clear, and it's an important fact because we're 23 seats short. So I want people to feel empowered that if they want to continue with the plan, if they want the 2 million more jobs, if they want the plans in our manifesto, the right to buy your house, more childcare, then they can vote for those things knowing we're in 23 seats short of delivering those things and stopping the nightmare of a SNP Miliband concoction.
So let's talk about the right to buy then. You reheated that as a policy.
Reheated's a bit unfair. This is a massive policy that would give millions of people the right to do what I suspect you've already done and buy your own home.
So do you think, when you look at the policy from 2012 that you already announced, and even from the 1980s, a feature of the record of that policy is that you have not replaced the social houses? So it's easy to say you will not with this, and there'll be less social housing.
Obviously, it takes time to replace. You get the receipt from the house you sell, and you then need to spend that money in the same area building a new house, and that takes time. But the ambition of one-to-one replacement is absolutely there. And the difference and advantage with this policy, because we're saying that local councils should sell off their most expensive properties when they become vacant. Some properties in London, council properties, worth £1 million. With that money, you could build, 8 flats for people on housing waiting lists, some of the poorest people in our country who'd love to be housed in the way that they're not today.
It just rather looks that you have this long-term economic plan, but just before an election, a series of short-term giveaways on housing, on pensioner bonds.
Well, I don't accept that at all. What is short-term about the right to buy? The right to buy your council house was not a short-term policy. It was a long-term fundamental change in our country that gave millions of people who didn't have an asset the chance to buy and own a home of their own. I feel that deeply as a Conservative. That's something I want to see more of in our country. Pensioner bonds, it's not a short-term policy. It's saying to elderly people, you've retired, you've worked hard. Because of the financial situation globally, interest rates are low. So here's a way of putting your savings to work to give you a better standard of living. More childcare for working families. That's about helping people who want to work more hours or go back to work have that choice. These are long-term policies that we can afford to do because the long-term plan's working.